Hi, I'm Greg Farrar. It's July 11th, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. Hopefully this time I will have fewer of the technical difficulties that plagued my last time. I still don't quite know how much of that even really made it through the stream, but looks like the video on YouTube is about 36 minutes long, which is the majority of it, so it's a lot better than it might have been. Still, this time hopefully I'll be able to get through all of it, countries, states of the United States, and regions of California. We're going to focus, as always, less on the total numbers and more on the trends, where things are going, what we can expect to happen in the short term based on the growth trends we see. Let's start with the countries. All right, so as usual, the United States leads in total cases. Brazil, India also has passed a while ago and become number 3. India's population is so large that in adjusted by population, they actually are not much of a hotspot or even warm. They're actually quite cold, but they show up on this graph pretty substantially. And similarly, the daily cases. But the graph I really like, and those other two graphs, by the way, you can get them all over the place. Total cases by country over time, total daily cases, or daily cases over time, those are everywhere. The places that I focus are on the adjusted by population daily cases and on the growth rates. So here adjusted by population, so we can actually compare countries to each other, not just in total numbers, but in relative numbers. We see a very nice graph here for Qatar. Qatar has just been top news for us for months because they've had such a bad outbreak. Apparently because they have work camps around their oil fields that are just packed full of people, and there was a terrible outbreak there. But it is great to see that from a peak well above 600, and we don't usually see 600, that's pretty extreme, 600 daily cases per million. It peaked, at least the trend line peaked around 600. If we were to look above that, we'd see numbers much higher, 900, 1,000 on particular days. But the trend line's best guess of the general trend peaked at 600, but now has dropped way down to under 200. This actually means that Qatar is no longer a daily cases hotspot. It's been a long time since we've been able to say that. Qatar has dropped out of the list of daily cases hotspots, those over 200 daily cases per million. The only daily cases hotspots are Bahrain. Qatar's neighbor really tends to move kind of with Qatar, but it's taking a lot longer to recover. Nevertheless, it's at least flattened out. Oman, Panama, the worst, interestingly, of the Central South America cluster. We hear a lot about the Central South America cluster, but we don't hear much about Panama. Panama is fairly small compared to, say, Brazil. And it's just not making the news in the way that we're hearing about Panama or about Brazil especially, but also Ecuador, maybe Chile, even Mexico, but none of those have it as bad as Panama. Panama is a hot spot. It's got 260 daily cases per million, which puts it way above most other countries. And these are only the top 25 countries in daily cases per million, so there are 100 plus countries, a lot of countries that aren't even shown on this graph, all of them below the bottom here. So all of these countries have it relatively bad. The very worst, Bosnia, Herzegovina. I used to know how to say that. I think Herzegovina is correct. It just took me a while. Bosnia and Herzegovina are at 160. Is the trend line? No, at 60 is the trend line. Not even warm. Warm spot is 100. So they're, even though these are among the warmest countries, they are only at 60. But then we have a whole bunch of countries. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can go to the website, gregfarrar.us, if you want to dig in on see which line is which. You can't tell them apart by colors because colors get reused in most of my graphs because there are just too many lines to have distinct colors. But I can point to them, or you can point to them if you're on the website. So lots of warm spots, quite a lot of them, maybe 10. And then the rest of the world is doing pretty good. Though even if you look at something like Bosnia-Herzegovina, you have a rising number. So this has just recently shown up. It's the 24th on our list of 25th, and it's shown up because it's rising. As the lesser hit countries rise, if they rise, some of them just are fine and stay there, but if they rise, they eventually make it into the top 25. And when we see that, we can see how they got there. They got there by rising. But there are a lot of countries that are not rising. Some countries, not a lot here. About 4 of them. Qatar, of course. Chile, also notable as part of the Central South America cluster. Chile is dropping. Kuwait, which seemed like it had a real problem, seems to be getting better. Peru also getting better as part of the Central South America cluster. I'll pick out a couple though, the United States and Brazil, just for fun, because these make the news especially. Both seem to be rising, though certainly Brazil has had some very low days. Indeed, that day is not even warm. But the last 4 days are still hot. 4 is enough for me to say that's a real thing, not just noise. So maybe these are the noisy ones, and it is in fact still rising. There's a dog barking out there. I'm going to close my window and see if we can get a little bit of a little better acoustic environment in here. Okay, and then the United States, which just keeps rising. For the longest time, the United States was under 100. You can actually see it on this graph. It was never warm, never warm, never warm. There was all sorts of news about the United States, how terrible this state or that state was, New York, for instance. But it never got warm as a whole until finally, around June 21st, when a whole bunch of states started coming on strong. For instance, the Gang of Six, which I'll talk about some next time, next segment when I talk about the states. Those 6 states, which include Arizona especially, really took off, and that was when the United States started to take off. Now those 6 are still going pretty strong, though as we'll see, there are signs of recovery for all of those. But now there's a new wave with the Floridas and so on also taking off, and so it just keeps looking worse in the United States. And the very latest day, United States at 206 daily cases per million is the first time the United States has been a hot spot. Just one day is not enough to say anything, but you wouldn't be too surprised to see that given the trend of the 6 days before it. Those 6 days trending sharply upwards, and now finally for a day, but very likely not for just a day, we have hit 200. Trend line hasn't quite reached there, but we have a pretty steady rise here still. So that's the United States. I'm not going to talk too much about this. This graph is very different from the others in that it shows each country's trajectory from the time they first got warm, 100 daily cases per million. Just worth noting that Qatar was extraordinarily bad. Up to 700 in the 14-day moving average. Extraordinarily bad, but now doing a lot better. And then we see a lot of the other countries of Europe, especially Belgium, Spain. Can't even read that. Is that Finland? Ireland. Belgium, Spain, and Ireland. Generally, Europe has been doing better and better. And I guess Singapore is doing well as well. So these are some of the countries that got it early. You can tell because their tails are very long here. They've had more than 100 days since they hit that. But they rose and fell within 20. They hit 100 and never got to hot, never got to 200, and dropped away and have been good ever since. This again is the trend that I keep harping on, that I think is generally the way things go, that once a country or a region of any sort gets bad, it then gets better and it never comes back. You don't see any, I think, among the states, maybe just a touch here. No, that one got better again. There are no examples among the countries that I'm seeing here of a country that got warm and then cooled off to below 100 again, and then came back in a second wave. None. There are none of those. We have some of those in the States. Most notably, I'm blanking on it right now. Who is the state that's Louisiana, I think. Louisiana, maybe Delaware, among the states of the United States seem to have come back after a recovery. But even among the states, it's very rare. So more evidence here that once a country recovers, it does not come back, at least within a few months. Now, long term, we might see something like flu season, where every year it comes back, or it comes in waves, but I have a feeling we're not going to see waves that hit 100. That the waves we'll see in the future will be small enough that they'll stay below that 100 mark. The rope charts, another major reason why I do this live stream, because I think and we'll see this more in the states section as well. The rope chart gives us a real sense of where things are headed. Not so good for Israel, for instance. Israel, which right now, by the way, where is Israel? Let's look at Israel. Yeah, Israel. Israel has only one day. It just hit 100. There's only one day since Israel hit 100, so there's nothing useful there. Is it even here? Yes, it is. If we look at on this graph, Israel is, well, we can see why it's looking bad in the rope chart. There's a lot of points here that are above the trend line. Israel has just recently become warm, and it's just getting warmer. All of the recent days have been warm, or it's not yet hot though in daily cases. But the growth rate, especially very recently, is extraordinary, and at over 10%. We seldom see that. 6 is kind of a normal maximum. We do see more, but it's especially among the largest countries, the ones that are hardest hit, where we're not looking at every single weird outlying island that might happen to have a case or two. It has a case today and 2 tomorrow, and suddenly they've got 100% growth rate. These are the countries that already have a large daily cases per million. They tend to be not super tiny countries, and so we don't have a lot of really extreme trend lines here. So that is something. There's something going on in Israel. The rest of the countries, though, roughly split around the 0 line, maybe a little more above and below, which means that of the hottest countries, the ones with the hottest daily cases per million, the ones on the graphs we saw above, maybe most of them are growing because they're above 0 in growth, but a lot of them are shrinking. But I would say it's kind of a mixed bag here, but actually maybe I won't say. It's about, the question is, of those that are growing, is their growth rate growing? Are they accelerating, or is their growth rate shrinking and they're going to end up below 0 sometime soon? Hard to say. We've got lines like, well, the United States, certainly one of the worst, in company with Ecuador and Argentina. There's that Central South America cluster. Places like Brazil that have been looking a little bit better. Let's see what Brazil's doing. So. Brazil is doing a little better. But some of the smaller countries in the Central South America, I think, are just now getting their own waves. And then there's the United States, which is kind of doing its own thing up above, up in the United States, where the states are staggering their waves, or 10 at a time of them get it and then get over it, and 10 new ones get it and get over it. And eventually we'll run out of states, but until we do, we see something like this, 6% daily growth rate, very high daily growth rate in the United States, and accelerating. So you see those three there, and that's really just bad news all around. These are reasonably hot countries, or they wouldn't have been on this graph at all in daily cases, not in growth. They're hot just in the daily cases per million. But they're also hot spots, bona fide, more than 5% growth hot spots on this chart. But they're also accelerating upwards. They're slanted upwards. So everything bad we could possibly imagine is happening in the United States, Argentina, and Ecuador. Mostly the other states, other countries that are above 0 And of course, we talked about Israel is also terrible. Most of them seem to be trending downward. So other countries are looking like they probably are headed towards recovery, but not those three. And actually not Kuwait either, I think. It's interesting how Kuwait is suddenly showing a sharp, well, it's not that sharp a growth, where at the same time, Kuwait is showing that it's beginning to drop away. Are we just seeing the beginnings of an acceleration in Kuwait, or is there something weird with the data? It's interesting. I don't usually see such clear, how is this possible? I ask myself, that Kuwait is growing in daily cases at 3% a day and yet shows this. Well, I guess I know how this is possible. It's because this is the 14-day trend line. Each one of these points is a very long-term trend line, 14 days. And so a short-term thing like this, no, it's not that short-term. Let's look at Kuwait a little bit more. I'm not going to spend too much time on Kuwait. Okay, actually, yeah. So there was a really big spike for in Kuwait where it was suddenly at 9%. I vaguely remember that, and now it has a sharp recovery. Okay, so this actually does make sense. It's just that the trend line hasn't figured out yet that Kuwait is recovering, but by all indications it is. The last 3 days are negative growth, and the trend of growth is strongly downward. All right, moving on. Just briefly, we'll look at this very messy one showing all the countries. Here's the zero line. We can't possibly tell which is which. I guess it's just for kicks we can say, well, Namibia and, wow, Eritrea. I do not think I've ever spoken that in my life. Those are, and these include some of the small countries, not the very smallest ones, but some that I haven't heard of. And I've heard of a lot of countries. But those two are growing at 40% a day. That's not necessarily alarming because it could just mean they have very few cases now. And they had 10 cases yesterday, and now they've got 14 today, and that's a 40% growth rate. I don't know. I don't have the data here to necessarily look into that. But these are, at this point, I'm not going to get super worried about them. We'll see if they persist, then sure. But here the center line, about half of the countries in the world are growing, about half are shrinking. We've definitely seen this better. I think a month or 6 weeks or maybe 2 months ago, almost all the countries seem to be shrinking or heading towards shrinking. So there is something going on. I guess it's probably something like what's happening in the United States, which is to say countries that didn't have it that bad have belatedly caught it, and we're having a rolling series of waves. Again, the good news shown on this chart, countries that get over it don't get it again. Usually, you might see, Kuwait actually kind of was almost a counterexample. It got big, it got up to hot spot territory, it dropped down, never below 100 again, and then it was up a bit again, and now it's dropping down. So there's some waviness in it. But we don't see any countries that have dropped below, say, 50 that have come back. And so in order for the world's growth to be, or cases to be rising, as it is, substantially, for the world's cases to continue to rise like this, that can only mean that that there are new countries picking up the slack, specifically Central South America. Okay, I'm getting an indication again there's some sort of wireless streaming problem. I'm just going to keep going because last time it wasn't actually a problem. But I'll probably pop out of here now and then to see if it's if I'm really losing my connection. It does seem like I'm still streaming according to my streaming software. Let me just try something. But I can't ping Google. This is starting to seem like Thursday. All right, I'm going to shut off my. No, am I? Is it working? Is it working? Still not. As I can tell, I'm back now. I'm gonna move on to the states. Okay, as usual, we have some strange things happening here in our reporting of New York. New York just wildly dropped for a while there. That's not real, but at least in recent times it has flattened out again. And so the numbers, the top line you see for New York is the real line. Do not believe the lower numbers here. So New York then continues to be to have the most cases, but it is really possible to imagine now that California might catch them. New York has flattened out long ago, has very few new cases. California adding 10,000 cases a day in only 100,000 cases away. What is that, 9 days? 9 days from now, California will cross New York unless it changes its trajectory. And we'll see. I think its trajectory is pretty steady right now. We're seeing a very steady upward here. At least it's not accelerating, but it's way above its trend line. California looking quite bad here. Florida and Texas also. Bad news. And then there's the rest, which are better. Though, you'll notice I'm not talking about Arizona and so on. This graph is talking about total cases, which means that if you're blazing hot but you just got there, it's not going to be showing up in this graph yet because you haven't had enough days of blazing hot to make your total cases anywhere near New York's. Or if you've just been slightly warm for a while and never really hit, say, California's level of daily cases per million, you'd be a part of these chunk down here. You could still have quite a high growth rate, but if you haven't been growing long enough, you might still have not that many daily cases per million. Okay. Anyway, moving on to one of my favorite graphs. I always do like the daily cases per million graph. It lets us compare states. And this graph is not going to have the problems I just talked about, how New York seems to be important when it really, really isn't anymore. Now, Arizona is important, and it really, really is still, though there's some signs it may be getting better. We'll look into that later. But Arizona is still far and away the largest in daily cases per million. As we saw, Qatar got to maybe 500, 600 with this trend line, 600, 700. Arizona is very likely going to exceed Qatar. It's going to actually be worse than the worst nation in the world in terms of daily cases per million. It's already hit 500, and according to this, it's rising fast. Let's just focus on Arizona for a minute. So, rising fast still. Most of the lines are above the trend line, suggesting that it's still accelerating. Its growth rate is rising. But maybe a few points of somewhat happiness there. The latest 7 days or so, if we were to look at just these 6, I guess, 7, they're all much lower than the 7 days before that. That's cherry picking a downward trend, so it's not necessarily anything to think means much, but this is the sort of stuff that the rope chart is going to be doing, is looking and saying, well, what about this 7 days? How that compare to this 7 days or this 7 days? And so if we actually go look at Arizona on the rope chart, we start to see not yet super strong, but definitely a downward curl. And getting downwarder. Each of these points is an average of 7 days, the growth rate over 7 days. And you can see the latest day, the latest 7-day period, we actually had a negative growth rate on average. And 2 days before that, also a negative growth rate, but then there was a 3% growth rate the day before that, and there must be one, yeah. If we look at the growth rates here, we see that there are a whole lot of days where Arizona is starting to shrink. Still, there are a lot where it's growing, and sometimes growing quite a lot, 15%, but there was enough of a mass down here of days where the 7-day average was lower, was negative, that we start to see a downward trend there. And I harp on this because Arizona is the leader of the Gang of Six. And the Gang of Six is, with one exception, is all doing this. Gang of Six, I keep bringing them back, and I show the graph every day, and it looks better. Those of you who watch or look at the blog or look at this yourself have noticed this looks better all the time. We are seeing all of these now strongly downward, with the interesting exception of Alabama, which was never the worst anyway, but it almost seems like Alabama's making its own little wave, or it's decided to join the next wave. But it's still growing at 3%. But recall that we sometimes see 10% growth. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some growth rates pushing 10% when we look at the hardest hit states like Florida right now in growth rate. But Arizona is now down to under 3.5%. Still a high growth rate, 3.5% every day. That's a high growth rate. That's going to get you into 1,000% or something in a year. But it's a lot better than it was. It was up in the 6 range for individual points, and the trend line says it was up to almost 5. So this is why I do this live stream, is because first of all, let's just look at this one. For a while, the news media was focused on totals. Who has the most cases? And New York just kept winning that one. New York has more cases, and we see it for the United States. The United States passes 3 million cases. It's front page news. Okay, that's, I think, not all that interesting because it's not adjusted for population. When you adjust for population, then you start to see, well, where is the United States really? And for the longest time, it wasn't that big a deal, even though it kept making news by passing new milestones in total cases. Now, actually, the United States is kind of a big deal. It's big in almost every sense in this epidemic. It is the world epicenter. But still, and now that New York, I guess, is no longer news, the news is things like this graph. If you go to look at New York Times or Washington Post or CNN, Washington Times is what I meant to say. Anything. Fox News, you look at any of these news sources, you will tend to see this graph, or what you'll really hear is you'll hear that Arizona set a new record. They have a new record number of cases. And I guess we're going to start seeing that disappear from the news. But because Arizona, I think, is no longer going to set a record number of new cases, we may see that 700 daily cases per million is the total peak of their entire epidemic. But what you see when you look at this is the sense that it's just going up and up and up. And they are having new cases each day. And what's more, it's plausible they'll see new record cases each day because their cases are growing. The growth rate of Arizona is positive. They are seeing 3% growth of new cases each day. I take back what I said. This probably isn't the peak. There will be some noise above 700 probably, because on average the daily number is still growing, and you can see that on this trend line very broadly. And so you can say every day correctly, the 7-day moving average of Arizona is higher than it ever has been. Actually, let's look at this is even better. This is great. 14-day moving average of Arizona just keeps going up, daily cases per million. And you would think there's nothing good about this. It just rises and rises and rises, and every day it's more cases they had the day before. And yes, that's kind of terrible. But what they don't say in these reports is that the growth rate is dropping. They don't show this, they don't shine this light of hope that says, if things keep going the way they are in Arizona, that in, I don't know, what is it going to be? How long till this reaches 0? Well, it's a while, a month maybe, because these do accelerate downward. That in a month, we can see it, it's moving, it's consistent, it's heading towards this place where it will then peak, and then we won't have more new cases every day. So this is the warning, or the projection of what's to come in Arizona. This is not the projection of what's to come in Arizona. This is what's happened in Arizona, and it's been terrible. But Arizona is heading towards a better place. And so that's if there's one thing that I try to bring out, and this was the main thing that I started talking about when I first started this live stream at the United States level, is that the United States was doing exactly this. It was going up and up and up. But if you looked at this graph, you could see that it was trending downward. So all of those states, except the oddball Alabama, are now trending downward. And indeed, North Carolina looks likely to cross zero in a week or something, or even a few days, and actually start shrinking in daily new cases. These are farther away. They were very hard hit. They have a long way to come back from. But to me, the top news here about Arizona is not Arizona is still going up, but that Arizona is trending towards a recovery, as with all the Gang of Six. So that's the good news. The bad news is places, actually, let's compare Arizona, one of the hardest hit states in the past, now looking a little better, compared with Florida. Now, Florida is the bad news. This is what we don't want to see. Though even this is showing just a hint of, actually more than a hint, Florida is actually looking like it's trending towards recovery too, but we can't quite see it as clearly yet. But Florida is growing at 7% a day. That's a very high number. And the growth rate is accelerating according to this trend line. So Florida has it bad at this point. However, as we look at that, I don't think I've quite noticed this about Florida, so this may be only really clear in the past couple days. If we look at Florida, all of the latest points, it's not shrinking, though it did have finally one that was very slightly 2% shrinking. It's not shrinking, but it's a lot below its trend line. So it has all these growth rates in the past week, each of them an average of the week before that day, in the realm of 3-2%. And this really suggests to me that the trend line actually is probably more like, you could draw it at 2%. If you were to just grab this part of the graph, the recent, I'm going to totally cherry pick this just to make my point. If you were to grab the recent part of the graph and say, what's the trend here? It's not this. The red line is not the trend. The trend, I'd say, leads from upper left to lower right. And in fact, Florida for weeks now has been trending downward in growth rate. In fact, given the fact that it's crossed zero here, it seems to me like it's recovering faster than Arizona is. Now, Florida is still doing its thing up here, and is looking, it's actually ahead of Arizona for this time of in its epidemic. 20 days in, it's up above 200 daily cases per million. That's an extremely high number. It's a very, very hot state, more ways than one. But epidemically speaking, Florida is looking bad in total daily cases per million. And the trend line still says it's looking bad in growth, but it's very clear to me where this is headed. That Florida's trend line is also going to bend downward, just like those Gang of Six. Florida is bending downward right now. You can already see the sort of the elbow right there, as it was sharply upwards, and now it's slightly upwards. And I think in just a week at most, we're going to see that level off and head downward. So good for Florida. Louisiana, however, it's hard to say. It's such a mess of dots. I guess it's rising. Louisiana seems to be a growth hotspot. Louisiana is continues to be our one really extraordinary exception to the rule that once you get it, you never get it again. Louisiana has got it again, and of the states that have been around in warm territory for 100, even 80 days, Louisiana has got it way worse than everyone else, and it's rising sharply. So Louisiana, one of the worst states right now. Very surprising, given that they seem to have had it under control. And let's look at Texas. Texas also looking pretty problematic, not quite as bad as Louisiana. Where is Texas? Oh, that's right, this is alphabetical. Texas has not had it for very long, but it is a hot spot now and is rising. I'm finding myself using this graph almost more than this one, though they do much the same. But I like the moving average, the way it smooths things instead of it actually turns faster than the if you look at Texas on this graph. These lines are very conservative. They refuse, for instance, to bend upwards, even though anyone can see this is bending upwards. Well, I guess there are some counter examples there, but surely the trend line should bend upwards. But this particular algorithm, it waits a long time before it'll believe that there's a new trend. The trend has changed. Very conservative, a lot of momentum on this line. But this one, well, unfortunately, this one doesn't go on for very long. It's only since it hit 100, which is right around here. So pretty much the one below just has this sharp upward line, and so it represents it here as pretty much almost a straight line, just going upwards. So Texas not looking so good. Definitely a hot spot, still rising and still accelerating. Texas has got everything we don't want to see in a state. And there are just a lot of, I'm just gonna turn on all the dots for a minute just so we can see the general trend among the warmest states. There's just a lot of lines that follow the path of, and the one I'm tracing out with my cursor here, like this purple line here, Washington, diagonally and up, above zero, substantially above zero, and accelerating. Most of the states are doing that. We have a fair number of exceptions. Arizona, as we see, is recovering. In fact, the exceptions, as I look at it, are the Gang of Six. So you see the Gang of Six, which have bucked the trend, or really they've gotten over the trend, and then you see everyone else, all the wannabes, I was calling them a month ago or 2 weeks ago, Gang of Six and all the Gang of Six wannabes. Well, it's no longer cool, apparently, to be going up like this. The Gang of Six are marking their own trend downward, but all the other states that followed their lead are still wildly upwards. Now, I think we're going to see that all of these states, all the ones that are accelerating upwards, are going to, in a matter of about a month, turn the corner, the peak of the growth in the way the Gang of Six has. And the fact that all six, well, 5, I guess, of the Gang of Six have done that is to me just more evidence that that's sort of the inevitable trajectory of the epidemic in a state. So I'm going to take out the Gang of Six because that's really kind of interesting. What happens when you do that? What happens to the rest of them? And Utah. Oh, that's pretty. That's fun. That's cool. Utah is gone from this list, which means that, no, it isn't. That's right in the middle. I was going to say it meant that it recovered so far that it was gone. Okay, so Utah is still there and has a while till recovery. Nothing here is looking good except this line, Mississippi. Mississippi is a weird one. It's followed its own little path. But right now, Mississippi is about holding even. I'm guessing that Mississippi is actually a latecomer to the party, and that it is going to take off like all of these, and it'll be one of the very last states to recover, because it's going to be one of the very last states to actually catch it. Let's see though, did it have it before? Maybe I'm just misremembering. Okay, Mississippi actually has it fairly bad now. It's just flattened out for a bit, and that's why it's down there. Mississippi is not following a traditional trajectory here. They hit 100 but just stayed there for a long time, kind of like California, and then they went up for a while, kind of like California, and maybe they're peaking now. So I take it back. Mississippi probably is not a latecomer. Mississippi is just going through a typical trajectory like what New York did. Let's find New York, where except for this long period where they couldn't decide if they were warm or not, they hit warm, they rose just about the same rate as New York. They peaked about the same time as New York if you ignore the starting stretch. And if they follow the trajectory of the other states, they'll be heading downward now. They'll be heading downward at about this angle. They will hit 100 daily cases per million at about 60 days in. They'll recover and they'll never come back. That's the trend. We have obvious exceptions. Louisiana. But among these, the growth rates of all the hottest states are pretty big. They're all warm spots. At least 3% is more than warm spot. Warm spot, 1%. They are all warm spots. Every single one of the hottest states in daily cases per million the states that have the most cases per day, adjusted for population, every single one of those states, except the Gang of Six, which is now recovering, following its own trajectory down, every single one of those is a warm spot. A lot of them are hot spots, and they're all accelerating, without exception. I don't have such a consistency of statement very often, but we're seeing it here. Mississippi, the other exception, which they've peaked in advance of these. So what's going to happen with these states? Well, it seems to me that all of these states are currently experiencing, and they've been going for about the same time as well, since about early May. They've been rising in growth rate. They're all experiencing something like the Gang of Six wave. And so it's almost as though they have all joined into a single wave. Every other state, and that's just the 25 hottest, but so there may be another 20 more to deal with later. But of the ones that are hot, they got hot by being part of a wave, and they all seem to be forming a single wave, which is the one after the Gang of Six, still looking terrible, still growing quickly, still accelerating. But if they follow the Gang of Six and everything else, almost every state we've ever seen before, they're going to peak on this graph, they're going to drop down to zero growth, then they'll peak on the other graph, then they'll drop down to 100 daily cases per million, and then they'll drop below, and they'll never come back. So it appears there is a huge wave happening now that is 20 states, that is kind of every state that hasn't already gotten it. Not really, I guess. We had the Northeast was about 10. That was kind of the first wave. And then we had a smattering of states with high population, of the Illinois and Louisianas and Michigans and maybe a couple others. So that was maybe 15 in those early waves, all recovered except for Louisiana, which is certainly bucking the trend. Now we have 20 more, so that brings us to 35. So there may be another wave of 15 coming after this, as all the rest get it. But this seems to be what you could broadly call the third wave. And it's in full swing here. Gang of Six is starting to cool down in some sense in growth, but these guys are in full swing, and a lot of them. And this is why the United States is growing in daily cases, is because we just have a ton of hot states, not just in daily cases, but in growth. Yeah, and this, you can just see this if you squint and look back. It's just all up. It's up. Now, if you look at the details, you'll find a lot of the. I kept expecting to find the New England states. West Virginia. Oh, there we are. Connecticut. There's a few oddballs. I think Indiana can't really be where it claims to be. Probably a data thing. Kansas, interestingly, seems to be doing well right now. Nebraska also. There are a few states. Let's just pick one. Just Nebraska, just because it's not one that we normally talk about, which means it wasn't in the first wave, it wasn't in the second wave, it's not in the Gang of Six, and it doesn't seem to be in the new wave. Is it in the new wave? No, Nevada, but no Nebraska. So let's just zoom out and just see, of these states that haven't been hit yet, I'm afraid I'm not going to have, because Nebraska never reached 100, probably. There are a lot of states that have reached, yes, it did, good. Interesting. Okay, I just kind of missed Nebraska, I think. They came and went, and I never really noticed them. Because they hit 100, and then they hit 200. They were hot, just briefly. And then they recovered, and they've never come back. So Nebraska actually is following a perfectly normal trend. But they were first wave, I would say. How does this line up to Michigan? They were maybe the second wave, Michigan wave. And they're not totally recovered yet either. They're a little, it's definitely worrisome to have someone hang out at 80, because then you start saying, well, maybe they're going to pull a Louisiana, where you hang out at 80 and then suddenly you take off. Like, this is actually very close. Nebraska and Louisiana are alarmingly aligned, where they rose, they peaked the same time, they recovered, they hung out at 80, and then Louisiana just took off. Nebraska, who knows what's going to happen? My guess is it's going to go down, because almost all states do. But then you have your rare Louisiana or Delaware. Delaware also seems to be having a sort of a new wave. But anyway, the fact that the state that I picked out of nowhere, Nebraska, and thought might be a fourth wave or fifth wave state, and turned out to be a first wave state, that's encouraging. It means there are some states that I just didn't notice as they were experiencing their waves, and it may mean that after this wave is over, maybe there will be very little fuel left for this fire. Let's pick another one that's not on my radar. Mississippi, Kentucky. So what about Kentucky? Right now, Kentucky's growing 1%, not doing so bad. What is Kentucky's trajectory? Did they ever hit? Okay, so here Kentucky never hit 100. And if you see, this list here is about 25 tall, the thing I'm scrolling, so there are probably 35 states that have hit 100, which is most of them. And so Kentucky is a rare state indeed to never have even hit 100. A rare state anyway. So let me just find some other. I might even look at Colorado just because I'm in Colorado right now, this very minute as I speak. And Colorado has been an interesting case. Right now, Colorado is looking bad. Interesting. I don't think I quite believe it. Maybe. Colorado has had a couple of really bad days, 33% growth, 18% growth. Recall that each one of these is an average of 7 days. So it is possible that Colorado is about to experience a tremendous shooting to the moon of the growth rate. On the other hand, 3 days ago was negative 17%. So maybe we can cancel those out and say they just didn't report or something for a day. 2 days is too little to say anything. And Colorado's done this before, this crazy thing that happened back here. So I'm not really going to believe that yet. Let's see if we look at Colorado's overall graph. How does that compare to others? Okay, yeah, so Colorado followed the usual trend. It peaked, though it peaked really quickly. There was a time when Colorado was looking kind of bad. It was definitely warm, but then it recovered and really recovered down to 20s. That's almost New York range. And it's been gradually growing since, but still looking quite good in daily cases per million, around 50. It's not the direction we'd like to see it going over the last 30 days, but not yet. I won't be alarmed until it hits 100. All right, I'm going to stop on the states just because I've done so much and I want to spend a little bit of time on the counties. Moving on to the counties. There's just so much interesting happening in the states, frankly. The counties of California are just uniformly terrible, and the countries of the world are pretty much uniformly fine. It's just the states where all the interesting stuff's happening. But here you have the counties, uniformly terrible. We'll see. Let's look into the cases per million. Yeah, there's Imperial still, always the worst. Tulare, interestingly, is past. Kings was, for a long time, was one of the. Where is Kings? It was really up there in the numbers, and now it's still in the top 10 or even 5, but not so bad. Daily cases, not as bad as it was. Imperial still off the charts. Tulare, Riverside, San Joaquin. I'm going to go look. We're almost starting to get good data from this. This chart has not been useful so far because there just haven't been any counties that have hit 100. But now you can see our whole legend here on the right is full. We've got 25 counties that have hit 100. Most of them only just hit 100, so all the action is happening down here. But we do see Imperial at least showing that it's kind of plateaued. And then we see Kings, which is better than plateaued. It dropped and maybe then plateaued. So Imperial and Kings no longer growing madly. Tulare is kind of growing madly. So is Santa Barbara. Both of these in hotspot territory as well as Los Angeles. Yeah, hard to read. There are a lot of new counties also in hotspot territory, like Stanislaus, Merced, Riverside, Orange. I'll take a quick zoom in here just to see who has actually managed to reach hotspot. The colors are kind of terrible here. They are differentiable from each other, which is the main goal, which means that they sometimes can hardly be read at all, but at least you can tell them apart. So San Joaquin, that is, Imperial, Fresno, Merced. You know, I'm gonna change the zoom. My real question is, who has ever reached 100? Or 200, I mean. And one way to do that is just to do this, I think. It's gonna blow it all up, but I can just go across. The ones that have been warm are Santa Barbara, Tulare, Kings, Los Angeles, Riverside. That's so sharp, I can't even see it. Probably Kings still? I think that is all Kings. All right, I don't know that it's useful to look at it that way. Let's look at the rope chart. Let's see where things are headed. The rope chart, as I say, universally terrible. There's everyone is growing. These are just the high. Actually, let's look at the real rope chart just to see of all the counties, what's it looking like? Yeah, still universally terrible. We have just a couple slight rays of hope. Imperial, relatively small, had it really, really terrible, and so the fact that it doesn't have it really, really terrible anymore, but just terrible, makes it look good, growth rate perspective. Nevada is looking good. Everyone else is growing. Every single county. I've thrown out some of the really small ones, but this includes some fairly small counties. Up to 100,000 people, I think. Yuba, for whatever reason, is off the charts right now, and everyone is just, they're all growing. They're all growing. I guess there's just a little shred of news here. Well, no, Marin again. Marin has dropped to near zero growth rate, which is good. It's turning the corner towards recovery, but Marin was exceptionally bad, so it's kind of like Imperial, where if you're really, really terrible and then you just get to sort of terrible, it seems like you're recovering. But still, growth rate of zero that's all these have to get there eventually before we can say there's a recovery. But the state of California is being swept by a ubiquitous pandemic. Every county growing in daily cases, with just a few exceptions. Some of them very, very high in growth. Yeah, I don't know what to say. There's not much to say about California. It's got to get over this, and at this point, it's not really trending towards there. Maybe there's a little bit of a sense that some of these lines are a lot of them are horizontal and not heading upwards. Maybe the bulk of them are roughly horizontal, which at least means their growth rates aren't rising. But I'm not even sure of that. And this is again something, if you want to look at your particular county or look at another county, you can go to gregfarrar.us and you can zoom in on the specific lines, but it almost doesn't seem worth it, given that all of the lines are looking pretty bad right now. And we don't yet see in the county level the trends that we've seen at the state, especially, and maybe national levels, country levels, which is this idea that things rise for 30 days, peak, fall back to 100 at the 60-day mark, and then recover. We're really not seeing that at all. All sorts of these, all of the counties that have had it for 60 days are still hot. They're all hot, including this. They're all still hot spots. There are only 3 or 4 of them, and I guess one way of looking at that is California didn't have a problem, even though it kind of, people who lived there kind of thought it did. It didn't really have a problem until the past couple weeks. Until then, there were just a few hot spots where there were a lot, and there was Los Angeles too, which shouldn't be ignored. That was a significant problem in total cases, but by population, almost all the counties were very low in cases. And even Los Angeles wasn't super high to begin with. But now Los Angeles is hot. It's finally become a hot spot. And now everyone else has finally become a warm spot. And so now we can actually look at California and say, this is a broad problem. This is a problem that affects all the counties. Almost everyone's warm, or a lot of them are warm. Everyone's growing. There's not too much good to say about it. We'll just keep watching it, and I'll let you know when, as counties, I do believe they'll peak. I think they will follow a path, something like what the states do. This crowd here, I think as the good people of California panic, as they should, and start wearing their masks and start staying home and wearing masks, and getting tested and all the other things that can probably put a lid on this, then we'll start to see them following the trajectories that states have, I think. But that's weeks away. Most of these have just gotten warm in the past couple weeks, and as you can see, there are only 5 counties that have even reached 30 days, the 30-day mark so far. So in some sense, this is just beginning in California, and we can hope that what we saw with Imperial is not going to happen with the rest of the counties. It's unlikely, but there might be 1 or 2 that get it that bad. Hopefully the rest of them will be more like Kings at worst and will show some sort of a recovery, but at this point, not even Kings is showing a recovery. So bad news for California, some good news for the states, but mostly bad news for the states. But again, the trends the trends look promising, but still a lot of cases growing, a lot of people getting it, a lot of people dying, and other countries don't have as bad as the United States, but there are still quite a few that have it pretty bad. So that's the news. That's the bad news for today. I look forward to the day when I can give a glowing review of something. I mean, I suppose I could cover New York, but yeah, most of the regions that I'm covering are all looking pretty bad now. So sorry. I'll be back. We'll keep on this, and things will get better. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.